Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Well, the new Employment Permits Act introduces changes to the types and amount of employment permits that can be accessed by Irish employers. Minister Emer Higgins is the Minister of State with responsibility for business, employment and retail, and she joins us now to provide us with more information about employment permits. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning, delighted to be here. And maybe actually if I could just mention, I was down at the Flat Kill in Wexford over the summer and it was absolutely terrific. Great to see so many local businesses taking advantage of all the tourism and great to see so many people having such great fun in the sun.
Minister, you joined us on Business Matters back in May. At the time, you had only just commenced your role as Minister for State with responsibility for business, employment and retail. So what have been your highlights over the past few months?
Yeah, well, there's been loads going on, that's for sure. It's always an honour to get to go out and meet companies that are growing, that are employing people in our local area. When I was down in Wexford, I really got a great sense of that through the local enterprise office, who does incredible work supporting entrepreneurs and SMEs right across Wexford. And I know there's many LEOs doing that across the southeast region. So I suppose definitely a personal highlight is getting to meet those entrepreneurs who have taken that risk to start out on their own, who are chasing their dreams, if you like, and getting to see where that pays off and where that provides local dividend in terms of local jobs. This, in the last kind of 2 weeks or so, one of the things that have come into effect is our new employment permits legislation. So this is something I worked a lot on in the run-up to the Dáil recess. And we even, I spent a bit of the summer teasing things out and to get us into shape where we now have what I hope is a really well fleshed out legislation and new quotas for different industries. And I think that's going to be really positive for business. Obviously, before the summer, we announced our 15-point plan to support SMEs. And really, that was all about making sure that we were providing support, providing grant aid, and helping small and medium enterprises that we know are feeling the pinch as a result of, I suppose, the increased cost of doing business. So it was really good to be able to provide that support. I think that's gone down really well. So as part of that, one of the things we've done is launch the National Enterprise Hub, which is up and running. It's a call centre and an interactive website that's there to support SMEs and entrepreneurs to access all of the grant funding that is out there and that's available to them. Already we've had over 3,000 people connect in with that. And what's really interesting is over 90% of those people hadn't actually been linked in previously with any government agency. So It's good to see we're hitting a new audience and that we're really getting the message out there that government is here to help.
And of course, Fine Gael had its think tank on Wednesday last, and with Budget 2025 being announced on October 1st, what kind of supports can businesses expect to receive in the budget?
Yeah, well, I suppose I can't really preempt what's going to be announced in Budget Day, but what I can certainly say is that myself and Minister Peter Burke have been working really hard on a submission from our department, the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, that is really all about making sure that we're putting jobs first. So that means that we're supporting existing businesses and that we're supporting businesses to grow and new businesses to emerge. We've got fantastic talent here in Ireland, both homegrown talent and in terms of workers who come to Ireland to make Ireland their home and make a contribution to both our society and also to our economy. And we need to make sure that we're protecting that we're protecting our position and our competitiveness as a country when it comes to winning foreign direct investment and to winning talent as well. To me, that's all about making sure we have the right conditions for companies to succeed in and for companies to grow in and to be able to not just protect but also to create new jobs.
And what were the key supports that yourself and Minister Burke were looking for within your submission?
One of the things I think is going to be really important, and it's something we had signalled earlier on in the year when we announced our SME, our 15-point SME plan, was that accessing the National Training Fund has to be something of priority. And so I know the Taoiseach has supported us on that. And there are negotiations underway between various ministers, Minister Jack Chambers, Pascal Donoghue, and of course Minister Patrick O'Donovan in higher education, to see how we can access that training fund and put it to use. For me personally, one of the things I'd really like to see is us not just helping to fund training opportunities for people, but also supporting businesses with the cost of training. So I don't just mean the actual financial cost of training there. I also mean the cost it takes to have staff filling in for people who are on training, the backfill, if you like. So if you can imagine when you go to a training course, if you're in an office, perhaps it's okay to be gone for a day or two and you catch up, or workers may cover for you. But if you're in a more fast-paced hospitality, for example, environment, you can't have no one at a till. You can't have no one waitressing. You can't have no one behind the bar. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that the cost of training isn't just the actual financial cost of sending people to a training course. It's also the cost of backfilling those roles while people are out of the office or out of their workplace.
The rollout of auto-enrolment pensions was expected to commence on the 1st of January next year, but is it now more likely to start later than planned?
Well, no announcement has been made on that. I know my colleague Minister Heather Humphreys has been working day and night to make sure that we're in a good position, not just as a government, but as a society, to set us up for success when auto-enrolment comes into play. I met with many people working in particular in the legal industry in the last week or two who have said that there is a lot of workshops and a lot of information sessions going on to get businesses ready for this change. But I suppose what we need to make sure is that it happens firstly as quickly as possible, but secondly in a way that we're ensuring that businesses have the information, have the systems, have the ability, I suppose, to make this a seamless change. It's a really, really big change for business. It has been well signalled in advance. It's going to be really positive for workers right across the country, but we need to make sure we get it right.
And with increases in both the minimum wage and statutory sick pay days also expected for next year, has government considered pausing these increases in an attempt to curb the growing costs facing SMEs?
When it comes to national minimum wage, we do have a low pay commission that does extensive work on looking at what is a fair and a reasonable national minimum wage. And they look at it from both an employer's perspective as well as an employee's perspective. They did meet throughout the year, and they've only recently published their recommendations to government. At this point, those recommendations aren't public yet, but they will, of course, be taken into consideration, and a decision will be made on national minimum wage on budget day.
Last week, the Employment Permits Act was enacted, as you mentioned earlier, but why was new legislation needed in the area of employment permits?
Yeah, well, I suppose just to explain to any of your listeners who aren't aware, employment permits are needed by people who come from outside of the EU or the European Economic Area, and they need them in order to work in Ireland. So companies hire these people and they apply for permits for them. And they can only do this if they can't fill the job from within the EU. They hire them at specific wages for a specific job from a specific list of occupations. So we're talking about IT professionals, engineers, architects, doctors, nurses, physios, home care workers, truck drivers. And I suppose companies can only get work permits in this situation if half of their employee base is already from within the EU. So none of that is changing. That has been the rules up until now. But what is changing, or I suppose what I should say is what has changed as of 2 weeks ago now, are three things. Firstly, government is making it easier for people with work permits to change job or to get promoted. Secondly, we're bringing in a new pilot scheme for fruit and veg harvesters, and that's about providing seasonal work permits. And thirdly, we're increasing the number of permits for two specific sectors. So they're the home care worker sector and for people working on overhead electrical lines. And the reason for that really is to relieve pressure on our health service and also to allow for electricity connections for new homes, new infrastructure. And I suppose these are both really important priority areas for government. Here listening to this morning, who is an employer, the first thing really to say to you is that if you have a vacancy that you've tried to fill, that you can't fill, you should have a look on our website, enterprise.gov.ie, and you can see whether that occupation is covered by a work permit. And if so, you can recruit from outside the EU or the EEA through the government's work permit scheme.
So this is very much a sectoral approach that's been taken to the changes. So what specific changes will happen, let's say, in the home care area as a result of this?
Well, as a result of this, it means you'll be able to hire more people from outside of the EU to fill those jobs in the home care sector. So I think that's going to really bolster our our recruitment abilities and also bolster the numbers we have working there to deliver an enhanced service. We're also now going to be able to promote workers who are on work permits without needing to reapply for a new one. And that's really about being able to retain talent, to be able to develop your talent. And I think it makes it a more attractive place for you to come in terms of making that decision as to whether or not to move to Ireland. You'll also now be able to recruit further workers from abroad easier because now we're not going to need employers to take out a newspaper ad so long as they've advertised on a reputable jobs website. And I suppose that's in line with the more modern practice of recruitment. And most people do tend to apply online rather than in newspapers now. So I think that's positive too.
How many employment permits, Minister, are currently issued each year, and how much do you expect that to increase by?
Yeah, well, last year my department issued 31,000 work permits, and this year we're trending to exceed that. We already processed 19,000 in the first half of this year. I suppose maybe just to give your listeners context, workers from India, from the Philippines, from Brazil, they account for approximately 60% of those work permits, and they mainly work in sectors that have been identified to us as healthcare, IT, agriculture, forestry and fishing, meat processing, hospitality and construction. And ultimately, these are all jobs we need to fill. We're talking about doctors, nurses, people packing our Irish meat products, people building our houses, people driving our trucks to deliver the goods to our shops, and people cooking our food in restaurants. And these are all jobs that are really critical to us, not just as an economy, but also as a society.
So what will the new employment permit application process now look like, and what are the relevant timelines?
Yeah, so currently there won't look too different. It'll just be easier, really. And we are also moving to an online system, which would be a brand new way of processing our applications in a much quicker and easier time frame. One of the benefits of that would also be that your application will only be accepted by the your application will only be accepted by the system if you have all of the required information submitted. So that will reduce on waiting times where it takes one of our officials in the work permit section to look at something and say, oh, you're missing something, go back and request it. There's a lot of toing and froing sometimes, so it'll cut down on all of that churn and mean that we'll be able to make swifter decisions and mean that it'll be an easier process for people making those applications.
Will there be any changes to the labour market needs test requirement in the application process?
The labour market needs process is constantly under review, and sectors do always have to do a labour market needs test themselves. We encourage people to do that, and we encourage feedback on that all the time. There's no specific change under this legislation, but a lot of that is done by guidelines and regulations, so there are things we constantly keep under review.
And how will the new seasonal employment permit work?
Yeah, so that's, I suppose, something that's brand new. It is a new pilot scheme for fruit and veg harvesters, and it's all about providing seasonal permits. So rather than having a permit that will last 1 year or 2 years or up to 5 years, this is going to be specific to a season, if you like, a growth season. That comes into play later in the year. We're working with the sector at the moment to getting their feedback really to help shape that, because we want to make sure that this pilot works and it works well. And if it does work well, we will look to introduce it in other areas.
And will there be any changes to the minimum wage requirements for employment permits?
No, so we have a roadmap already published on this. And again, this isn't something that's dictated by legislation. We look at this on an ongoing basis. Any changes to national minimum wage obviously have an impact here, and so too does the living wage. But ultimately what we want to make sure is that as people hire people in from other countries, that they're setting wages at a reasonable rate where people can expect a reasonable standard of living, where, for example, they'll be able to rent, they'll be able to pay for food and groceries. And we want to make sure that makes sense. Some of the time it's linked to the threshold for family reunification. And I suppose that's particularly important where you're talking about female-dominated sectors, where if, for example, you're a female Filipino nurse and your children are at home in the Philippines, you know, your work schedule mightn't even allow for you to be able to Skype and Zoom at reasonable hours given the time difference. So what we need to make sure is that people in that situation have the ability to have the financial means, if you like, to be able to reunify with their family at some point.
And what controls have been put in place to ensure that employers have to go through the relevant process here before they look outside the EU to recruit from their pool?
Yeah, so that's all part of the actual process. So you need to have had a vacancy, have tried to fill it, and not been able to. And you also need to have less than 50% of your workforce already outside of the EEA. So they're the guardrails of this process. They aren't changing. That's worked quite effectively for us as a country, we feel, at this point. And what we want to do is make sure that we keep the things that are working and improve on the things where improvements are needed.
And finally, Minister, of course, artificial intelligence is on the mind of every business owner today. Some seeing it as an opportunity, some as a threat, and some see it as both. What are your thoughts on it?
I suppose it's both, really. But the reality is it's coming straight for us. So we need to make sure that we're prepared. That means upskilling your staff. That means being aware of what AI means, not just to you and your company, but to your industry, your sector. There's so much going on in this space, and you see local enterprise offices, you see chambers of commerce up and down the country doing so many different webinars and so many different information sessions. It's a fascinating area. It's very hard to keep up, as we all know, in modern society at the moment. But this is definitely worth something worth looking into, because I do think that it is going to change the way of doing business in many sectors. And I suppose if it's not something you're familiar with yet, have a look at all of the free supports available online to help get you there.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Minister Emer Higgins. And if you're having problems recruiting, then these employment permits may be invaluable for your business.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.